Hello, I'm Paddy Lambert and I'm a Project Officer at Oxford Archaeology East, and I'm going to be speaking to you today about our project that we completed last year on how to build a Roman villa, excavations at Corby in Northamptonshire. The site is located roughly to the north-east of Corby, near Kirby Hall, the 16th century English heritage property. It's in advance of some housing development. It is known that Northamptonshire is a region rich in resources such as limestone and iron ore, and it's been long known for a long time that the Roman activity in Northamptonshire is widespread and incredibly intensive. So the site itself wasn't that big, and it was about 200 metres from a known villa estate. We found basically an infrastructure project dating from roughly AD 200 to 400. So when I say an infrastructure project, I mean literally this. I mean a Roman infrastructure project in which to build or renovate a Roman villa. And on this site, we found a microcosm of this wonderful hustle and bustle activity dating from AD 200 to 400, as I said. So we found, as you can see on here, we found a lime kiln, stone quarries, clay quarries, the illustrious Temple Mausoleum converted into tile kilns. We had some field systems, a road or a trackway, and numerous post buildings and pottery kilns, and we had so much that it all kind of happened at once. And the site in relation to the villa itself, we knew the villa was there. So as you can see there on the geophysical survey, if you look at Building 28, Building 28 is essentially where the site was, and Building 28 is our Temple Mausoleum itself. But you can see by the geophysical survey that the Roman villa is probably a winged corridor type. It's not really known because it was only investigated very briefly by evaluation in around 2011 and again in 2016. So the villa itself, as you can see, in its relationship to our site, it's very, very close indeed. And it's you can also see that there are perhaps two phases of the villa itself. So perhaps that one half of our archaeological excavation of what we found maybe relates to the earlier villa, but I'll cover that in just a moment. So again, to show you on the ground, you can see the Temple Mausoleum tile kilns to the bottom of your picture, and then just how close in relation to the villa site itself the site actually was. So we begin at the beginning, inevitably. So we begin at the Temple Mausoleum phase of the site. We believe it's dated to around 150 to 250, so in line perhaps with an earlier phase of the villa itself. And when we began, it was completely unexpected. So this is essentially what we'd found in the very beginning. Just as you can see, around 4 walls. We say 4 walls. Sadly, one of the walls, as you can see, had been truncated by a modern trackway. So we found 3 concentric walls. And we did not know that in less than 6 months' time, it would turn into this. So what you can see here is perhaps one of the most complex and alarming and well-preserved Roman sites that perhaps any of us will ever see. And you can clearly tell that the complexity of this site is utterly extraordinary. And hopefully you can see the precinct walls around the outside and the cellar structure on the inside. But the level of renovation, as you could probably tell, was utterly extraordinary. So I'll try my best to give you digitally a tour of the mausoleum itself. So if we look at this again, within its own context, so the mausoleum simply consists of the walls you can see around the centralised structure. So you can see that clearly they don't survive very well towards the bottom of your photo, which was to the north of the site. You can't really see much of it, but because these walls were robbed out later on. They were incredibly robbed out later on, ironically, to build the tile kiln in the middle. But what you can see is a basic typological plan of what is known as a temple mausoleum. Now, a temple or a mausoleum, they follow basically the same ground plan. There are minor variations based on the architectural temperaments of the financier. It's believed to be the case. So we see a concentric squared precinct wall essentially going around, and this encloses a central structure of stone known as the cellar. Now, usually what you would find is something called an ambulatory, which means that the precinct walls are closer to the cellar. But in this occasion, it's really not the case, so we're unable to call it an ambulatory. It is far more likely to be a mausoleum, or a mausoleum, and these were called by the Romans monumenta, and it's literally where we get the word monumental from. And really interestingly about this, it was completely unexpected, and they're a very rare architectural phenomenon. And we can see some of the first phase stuff from the mausoleum itself, in the temple precinct walls itself, such as the way the walls are constructed. So what you can see here in front of you is part of the precinct walls where you see the faced stone at each side, and they are filled with the rubble core. The Romans weren't anything if not lazy when it came to the way they build things, the same as any modern builder today. In many ways, the path of least resistance is always the most preferred, and it also adds structural rigidity to your walls. So we can get an idea here of roughly how high these walls would have been on the precincts. We're looking over 2 meters high at the very beginning. And we know that this is probably a mausoleum, so we follow a similar villa, Lullingstone. Lullingstone is perhaps in Kent, is perhaps our greatest comparison. So it's from Kent, it's from around the same period, so 3rd to 4th century AD. And you can clearly tell at the top that we have a typological plan that is incredibly similar to our mausoleum at Corby. And it's a rather wonderful find, but they're very similar. However, a frequently asked question is that we are constantly asked, did you find any human remains or any kind of detail or evidence of any kind associated with its original funerary use? And the answer is, well, no. It was so drastically renovated that they either were removed or, indeed, more intriguingly, they were never there in the first place. So perhaps it was some kind of cenotaph to the original villa owner, perhaps, or his family, or their family. And then we get to the biggest and perhaps most drastic change of the landscape. In around 300 AD, the landscape was dramatically transformed from a bucolic villa estate with a temple mausoleum with no other evidence around it from that period, and it stood proud on its own atop a small ridge. And again, in around 300 AD, this was dramatically transformed into such a way that it was almost impossible to see through essentially the wood for the trees. So what we have, as you can see here, is an annotated idea because there's so much here. So I think it's better to just give a cursory example of what happened. So as you can see there's post pads for the later roof. This was reused from the cellar interior. So what had happened is they had levelled the cellar to a completely same level. They'd gone in and they'd levelled it. Now at some point we think that the mausoleum itself was perhaps dilapidated or in some form of disrepair. But it must be stated unequivocally that there is no evidence for sure that this was some kind of cynical and protracted effort to erase the memory of the former owner. It was simple prosaic opportunism in order that they found a simple shell, it was a perfect size, and they thought, well, with some small renovation, perhaps it was just make a really nice kiln or a really nice industrial site of some kind. So they actually robbed the precinct walls, which you can see at the top of your photo there. They robbed this precinct wall, and this was actually to build the Lime Kiln later on to the east of the site, which is, again, we'll get to. And you can see here where they have numerous post holes cut into the courtyard and the pottery kilns and the bricked up original door, which is probably my favourite part of the entire site, was the bricked up door. And you can see some architectural embellishment of the original mausoleum that they had kept. And this was probably because it was the strongest wall, for example, in the south. And this is an often not known image that we have shared, where you can see the bricked up doorway at the top of your photo. At the bottom of the photo is a level of detail of how they did this. So you can clearly tell the very first thing they did was they laid the walls, the interior walls of the cellar itself. So the cellar is just in here. I'll just go back in. The cellar is just at the middle of that photo, just there. That's the cellar walls. What they did, they laid all of those walls with a thick layer of clay to form a seal, essentially, hermetic seal. And you can see as well the heat impact of this. And they'd used rubble as well in order to make sure that the clay could stick to the walls. So they filled in all of the nooks and crannies of these walls. It was such an extraordinary degree. And then they built another wall. So they rebuilt the eastern wall of the cellar itself in order to build a kiln that you saw just a moment ago. And you can clearly see how they've done this. And it goes rather against what we think of the classic Romanized building, that they've just basically thrown this wall together, where they've over-mortared the wall. They've reused bits of Temple Mausoleum just to the right of your photo with the notch on the wall, and then they've built on the left, they've just they've just basically stuck in tile wherever they can fit it. And they've essentially thrown it up, because at this point, it is not about the aesthetics of the structure. It is about the simple functionality of it and whichever way works. And I think it's probably the most alluring of all the components of what we found here. It's the make, do and mend attitude that we found. And I've mentioned the bricked up door earlier on. This is exactly how they bricked up the door, which is they basically got handfuls of mortar and old tile and just smacked it onto the wall itself, onto the wall of the bricked up door. They just bricked it all the way, and it was rather astonishing to see, because, interestingly, right next door we found the original lintel, and this had been placed adjacent to the original door in order to place one of the later pile stacks in order to maintain the infrastructure of the tile kiln. And it was probably the most wonderful thing we found in many, many ways, because it was right next to the bricked up door, where they probably just removed it and stuck it down, and they didn't even try anything else. And you can clearly tell around that picture as well the make, do, amend attitude. There is a certain chaotic uniformity to how the Romans are redeveloping this building. And against the bricked up door, which you can see to the right of your photo, hopefully to the right is my right or your right, but you can see there's a pottery kiln. They constructed a pottery kiln right up against the door, clearly to possibly substantiate the level itself, or to substantiate the wall. And inside that pottery kiln, they used 2 imbrex tiles, enormous imbrex tiles that are far larger than normal imbrex. So imbrex are part of the roofing structure that you find. So you find tegular roof tiles, and then you find the curved imbrex. And these were enormous, but they'd used these as some kind of kiln infrastructure. We don't quite know why or how they did it just at the moment. And if we go back again to draw your attention to large parts of this that actually happened, so just to bring it all back to its context as well. So we have the bricked up original door, the stoke pit for the kiln I've just shown you, so that's the square kiln to the left, and the stoke pit and the other pottery kiln. So what you see is this dramatic landscape, because it all, inside the cellar itself, was a level of renovation quite unknown and quite surprising. So what we saw was they gutted the original cellar itself. They lowered the floor level. Hopefully you can see the floor level. If you look at the original wall to the top of your screen, you'll see there's a slight discoloration at the bottom of the wall. So that is the very foundation of the wall, and that is probably the original floor level. And they'd gutted it inside. So they dug it down, roughly a metre down, all the way around the cellar itself, and then they cut through the flue, which you can see at the bottom where the ranging rod is for the tile kiln, and then essentially they laid a sequence of reused tile, reused stone, reused tile, reused stone, and up at the top they then built housing for the pile, which you can see the pile, one of them is to your right of the screen, and you can see that they built pile, and again, in some places we even saw where they'd clearly hammered the stone in, probably with their hands, just to make it work. And again, to build the actual arch entrance to the kiln itself, so this is on the east side of the kiln, you can see here the heat damage first and foremost, where the ranging rod is, but what you do see is, again, this make, do and mend attitude towards the wall. So if I go back, if you look at the beautiful design of the original wall, it is built very, very well. So this was clearly designed and built with some care and attention to how it was going to look eventually, how it was going to be viewed by people, the spectacle of the architectural statement that they were making. Here, clearly can be seen that that is not the case. It is all about structural rigidity and using whatever they could just to simply make it work. So we can see that they've reused tiles, such as the bottom left corner. They've reused flat stones. They've reused Collie Western slate tiles, which was probably their slate original tiles for the roof for the mausoleum itself. And they've relaid them all, and they've banged it all with mortar. And you can see again what they've done to build the actual flue to the right. You can see again that they've just mortared that, so within an inch of his life, they've just mortared it and stuck it. So, again, just to give an idea again, I think it's always worth bringing it back to the overall photo, because, again, it's very difficult to get an idea of exactly how it would have looked. So, a frequently asked question we was asked a lot is, how did it look as a tile kiln? And we think that it's all down to the post pads for the tile kiln roof that you can hopefully see annotated here. These went all the way around the cellar of the kiln itself, the actual centralised cellar. They went all the way around, and we think it looked something like this. This photo is, well, this artistic impression is actually really, really interesting because it kind of brings it home to you exactly how it would have looked. So if we go back again, you see the post pads for the tile kiln roof, the entrance to the flue, and the bricked up door and everything else, and you go back again, and there we go. And I think that's a rather wonderful impression of how it would have looked. So we know that the climate of Britain is very playful. So perhaps seasonal production was in force here. Perhaps they were quarrying for the clay at some point, and in the winter months, and they were producing in the summer, because it was very difficult to keep maintain your temperature. So perhaps we get some idea of open to the elements that it is. And we produced, this tile kiln itself must have produced in the region of 10 to 15,000 tiles. Now this is only based on a small sample of the excavated amount of material that we found. And what you see before you is simply the waste product. Now do forgive the person laying on top, he is okay, but we didn't have a scale to hand at time, but I think it gives you a really good idea of the amount of waste product alone that this tile kiln produced, and this was all excavated by hand in wet weather. So I think it's a rather extraordinary perspective on just how much tile these things could adequately produce. And we didn't find many finds from the Temple Mausoleum or the tilery at this point. There were very, very little finds at all within the surfaces or within anything like that, because people weren't eating or drinking, obviously, within a kiln itself, and they were probably having their lunch somewhere else. But we did find something incredibly, these are incredibly rare and they're very special. We did find something that was quite astonishing because it provides us with a wonderful link to an actual tiler that probably worked on the site. And hopefully you can see just below the ranging rod, sadly it's broken, they always are, sadly it's broken, but you hopefully can see that someone with their finger, just before the tile has been fired, so probably when it was out to dry, has got their finger and very quickly written their name. So it's perhaps an N, which is slightly missing, and you'll see at the top, followed by an E and an N, and perhaps a T and an I. So perhaps Nentius or Nentii, and then at the bottom, E-C-I-T. Beckett. Nentius made this, or has made. And it's a really wonderful link to whoever this Nentius is, and we find that as a really poetic irony, that the villa estate owner would have spent thousands and thousands of the equivalent of our pounds on commemorating themselves and building themselves up in their identity of their enormous villa estate, and will never perhaps know the identity of the villa owner themselves, but we do know the name of one of the ordinary workers that would have worked in these, at times, incredibly treacherous and dangerous conditions. Suffice to say, incredibly hot as well. So, at the end of the life of the tileries, the stoke pits, the enormous stoke pits to the east and the west, if you draw your mind back to the overview photo, they were filled in. So at some point in probably the late 4th century, just before the villa started to perhaps decline, in line with the national trend, if you like, of Romano-British villa occupation, they were backfilled. And when I say backfilled, these things were backfilled almost immediately with such intensity And you can see the stope pit here, and hopefully in the section you can see just how much this was back. In fact, it was backfilled so quickly, the kiln entrance had collapsed due to the weight of the stuff that had been placed on top of it. And it comprised thousands of waste products from the pottery kilns nearby, and bits of brick, bits of tile. So what they have done is just thrown it in. They've just absolutely thrown everything in and leveled it all off when they finished with it. Now, we didn't really find any might suggest that they had commemorated or, I don't know, found some way of in relationship to the original mausoleum, such as any kind of votive deposit or anything like this. So it suggests that at this time, that ancestral memory or that memory had gone, and they were just backfilling it. They just thought it was done and it was being used. But that's not all. So that comes to the end of the tilery itself, and that is just one small part of a very, very intensive site. So the industrial landscape around the rest of the buildings yard, if you like, was quite astonishing. So if you can see on this, hopefully you can see, it's the Temple Mausoleum there, you can see that. And around the site was an enormous stone quarry, where what they had done is leveled the site. They'd lowered the site by about 1.2 meters. So in the distance between the back of the Temple Mausoleum, as you can see, and the big brown splodge, if you like, just behind it, the distance in between there is about 15 meters, and within that 15 meters, it had dropped by a meter. The whole land had dropped. The Romans had gone in and exploited this natural seam of limestone in order to probably, again, renovate the villa next door. And what we found is, at the top of the site, we had clay extraction quarries such as this. Interestingly, the clay extracted quarries wasn't used in the production of the tiles. We did some clay analysis where we chemically analysed the tiles being produced against the clay extracted from the quarries, and they weren't being used. We don't know why, but they weren't using this clay itself to make the tiles, perhaps made it a pottery or perhaps for another purpose of some kind. But this was quite an extraordinary part of the site. It was at the northern end of the site, and it followed a natural clay seam across the top. And we had this enormous quarry pit that I told you about. So really interestingly, this is where we actually found some of the material that they perhaps didn't want. They'd quarried this out, and this is the stuff they're looking for. So hopefully in the right side of your section, you will see this in the edge, is the much smaller limestone that they didn't really want. But at the bottom, when they go further down, they reach the level they need, the level they wanted, which is these larger, much more conducive to building, lovely bits of limestone. But for here, they seem to have just dumped it back in. Perhaps they just didn't want it anymore, and they just dumped it into the edge of one of the quarry pit areas. But from all of these quarries, they had reused some of the stone from the Temple Mausoleum, as well as some of this quarried stone, to build a trackway. And in this trackway, so this is taken from that quarry pit I've just shown you, it goes across the site, it snakes all the way down, and in the, where you can see all of the big bits of spoil and all the things, that's the quarry area. So what we have is, for the movement of resource, have a trackway to move up and down, to take resources from one part of the site to the other. And they had used, because it was a mixture of really well-dressed, well-shaped stone, so it suggests that they've reused some of the Temple Mausoleum stone in the construction of these trackways. And this recycling element is most prevalent all the way through the site, because we find it in perhaps one of the most alarming and alluring things of the site. And this is the lime kiln, as you can see. So this was produced lime, so they melted down limestone, and in order to make essentially mortar for the building next door. We're unsure whether or not it's been used in the Temple Mausoleum itself, or in the tile kiln rather. We tend to call it the Temple Mausoleum because it's our pet name for it. It's not very imaginative. But we have this wonderful lime kiln. It's been reused, as you can see, with reused stone from the Temple Mausoleum. Perhaps this is a better idea for it. And you can see that some of the white specks within the chamber itself are some of the lime that is still there. So this lime is astonishing, and it was enormous, absolutely enormous. It was about 4 metres in diameter and 5 metres end to end. And this would have produced tons upon tons of material. And then we get the pot kilns around the site as well. So these were astonishing, as you can probably see. The preservation of this is rather wonderful. And you can see that, again, they've reused tile and they've reused stone from the Temple Mausoleum itself because of their well-shaped, well-dressed nature. And they've also used part of the Collywest slate roof of the Temple Mausoleum itself in order to construct these. And these were cut in a vertical line against the side of the quarry area. And that was the second one. Yes, we found more than one. We found 3. And this was, again, the second one, where you can really see, at the top, you see some of the roof tiles, and you can see the way they build these things with the stokehold, the 5 clay floors. This was, at the very least, this was a really well-funded exercise. This can clearly be seen. There was a lot of capital put into this in order to facilitate this production. And some of the pot being produced here, we believe we've only covered, for the first assessment, around 30% of the entire pottery assemblage for the site. There was a lot of it, and we believe mostly they're making greyware dishes, perhaps, a type of black burnished copy, so a black burnished ware copy vessel, or indeed some kind of colour coat as well. But we're not entirely sure just yet, but what we do know is there's a wealth of this material. And from those pottery kilns themselves, we had another trackway, and this is the trackway that went all the way to the villa itself. So we had the trackway coming from the north of the site all the way down past the pottery kilns and then towards the villa. So it is literally a builder's yard, and it's an infrastructure project, and it might suggest that some villas have a zonal appropriation of space, such as this might have been for the industrialisation of the villa. What we don't know is the material produced just for the villa itself. Some of the finds we found was this rather wonderful, as you can tell, zoomorphic buckle. It dates from circa AD 350 to 400 or 450 if you want to push it a bit further. And as you can see, these are 2 dolphins arising, and they are kissing at the time. And it's a wonderful belt buckle. It's found complete, so it must be some form of casual. And you can almost hear the person who lost it, because this was a rather lovely find. And they were very fond of zoomorphic imagery and iconography within this period. And perhaps the greatest thing we found was hundreds and hundreds of these kind of tiles with cat prints, dog prints, deer prints, fox prints. A whole panoply of wildlife was populating this landscape at the time. So thank you very much for joining me on this wonderful roller coaster ride through our recent works at Prize Hall in Corby. And we will be keeping current archaeology abreast of all developments as we go, because inevitably there will be much more work to do, because for every question we answered, there are going to be hundreds of questions left to answer. And our post-ex process is slowly working our way through this. And we are beginning works right now. We're beginning works on the other side of the villa estate. So we might be able to see it all knit together